Imagine being abandoned at your lowest point, left to fend for yourself in the wilderness. Now, picture a little girl stepping in when no one else would. What happens next will change everything. A wolf, weak and abandoned, left to die by the very person who should have cared for it. But fate had a different plan. A little girl, with the biggest heart and the purest soul, found that wolf. And what happened next is nothing short of a miracle. Before I show you what happened when Thomas and Shadow's bond was tested once more, can I ask you something small? If you believe every animal deserves a chance at a new beginning, and that stories like this one remind us of the power of love and redemption, please tap that subscribe button. So many stories go unnoticed, but with just one click, you could help this story inspire someone who needs it most. In a quiet, remote village nestled between rolling hills, a solitary farmer named Thomas lived a life rooted in tradition. His farm was a modest one, surrounded by tall trees and miles of dense forest. His home, an old wooden cottage with ivy climbing up its walls, had been passed down through generations. For as long as Thomas could remember, the farm had been his life, his purpose. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he was content. His animals were his family. For years, Thomas had raised wolves, bred them for work and companionship. They weren't just animals to him, they were his pride. He knew each one by name. Each one had its own personality, quirks, and strengths. The wolves were not simply tools to him. They were part of his life, part of his daily routine. Over the years, he had become an expert in caring for them, feeding them, training them, and watching them grow. But this time was different. This wolf, this tiny creature he found one evening near the edge of the forest, was unlike any he had ever seen before. It was a pup, no older than a few months, its fur thin and matted. It was barely clinging to life, with ribs so visible that they almost seemed like they might pierce through its fragile skin. Its eyes, dull and lifeless, stared up at him with an almost hopeless look, eyes that told a story of pain, of abandonment. At first, Thomas thought it was just another stray, another unfortunate soul lost in the woods, perhaps separated from its pack. But as he carefully approached the wolf pup, he realized something was wrong. The poor creature's legs were weak, its movements jerky and stiff. It was clear this wasn't just a sick wolf, it was a wolf on the brink of death. But Thomas wasn't one to turn away from a creature in need. He had seen wolves in worse conditions before, and with the right care, they always pulled through. So he took the pup in, bringing it back to the barn and placing it in a makeshift bed next to the fire. He fed it scraps, mixed medicine with water, and rubbed its fur to keep it warm. He thought that with time, the wolf would recover. The first few days were touch and go. The pup wouldn't eat much, its body rejecting everything Thomas tried to feed it. It was a struggle to get the animal to take even the smallest amounts of food. Thomas was patient. He kept feeding it, kept offering it warmth, kept hoping that something would change. But as the days dragged on, Thomas could see that his hopes were beginning to fade. The pup wasn't getting any better. Instead of growing stronger, it seemed to grow weaker. Its fur remained thin and patchy, its eyes clouded, and it barely moved unless absolutely necessary. Thomas began to wonder if it was even worth the effort. In the back of his mind, the familiar voice of doubt began to speak. He had so many other animals to care for, sheep to tend to, horses to feed, fields to plow. The farm was demanding, and the more time he spent trying to nurse this wolf back to health, the more his other responsibilities suffered. He began to question whether he had made a mistake bringing the pup into his life in the first place. And the worst part, the wolf wasn't responding. After all the care he had given it, after all the time he had invested, it still wasn't improving. The other wolves in his care were strong, healthy, just the way they should be. They didn't need him the way this one did. This wolf had become nothing more than a burden, a drain on his resources. Thomas tried everything. He gave it the best medicine money could buy, but nothing seemed to help. He spent hours searching for remedies, consulting old texts, trying alternative treatments. But still, the wolf remained weak and sickly, and every day that passed, it seemed to lose more of its will to live. The farm began to feel heavier. The once peaceful existence that Thomas had known, with the steady rhythm of his daily chores, was disrupted by the constant worry over the pup. He started to feel a sense of hopelessness creeping in, a feeling that this wolf might be beyond saving. The exhaustion from his efforts weighed on him, and each passing day made him question whether he was doing the right thing. Should he keep trying, or should he accept that some things were just meant to fail? And then, one evening, as the sky grew dark and the wind howled through the trees, the decision was made. Thomas stood over the pup's bed in the barn, looking down at the creature that had captured his attention for weeks. It lay there, breathing shallowly, its ribs barely rising and falling with each breath. It was pitiful, fragile, and its body seemed to be deteriorating faster than ever before. In that moment, Thomas's frustration reached its peak. His heart sank as he realized he could no longer bear the weight of this responsibility. He had done everything he could. He had given it his time, his energy, and his care, but it wasn't enough. The wolf wasn't going to survive. Thomas knew that now. The pup's time had come, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The decision was hard, but it was also clear. He couldn't keep this wolf any longer. With a heavy heart, Thomas made the difficult choice to abandon the pup. He couldn't keep it. He couldn't afford the resources it required, nor could he watch it suffer any longer. He couldn't justify continuing to invest time and money into a wolf that was so clearly beyond saving. He gathered a few supplies, some food, a blanket, and left the barn. He walked into the woods, the silence of the night wrapping around him. He knew this was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything else. This was his only option. He found a secluded spot deep in the forest, hidden from view. There, in the darkness, he gently placed the wolf on the cold ground. He could hear the faint whimpers of the pup, its pitiful cries echoing in the stillness of the night. But Thomas didn't look back. He couldn't. He walked away, step by step, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. The wolf would have to fend for itself, survive or perish as the wild saw fit. Thomas didn't know what happened to the pup after that. He didn't know if it would die there, in the forest, alone and helpless, or if it would find its way back to strength. But one thing was certain, the wolf would no longer be his responsibility. As Thomas walked back to his farm, a deep, unsettling silence fell over him. His decision weighed on him like 100 tons of stone, but he tried to ignore it. He couldn't think about the pup anymore. He couldn't afford to. There was too much work to do, too many other things demanding his attention. But what he didn't know was that the wolf story wasn't over. Far from it. The next few days after Thomas abandoned the wolf were quiet, too quiet. The burden of his decision seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud, blocking out the peace that had once existed in his life. Every time he stepped outside, every time he saw one of his other wolves, a sharp pang of guilt pierced his heart. It wasn't just the act of abandoning the wolf that haunted him. It was the knowledge that he had taken a life, not just in a physical sense, but in spirit. In his mind, Thomas couldn't help but replay that moment over and over. The image of the small, fragile creature lying on the cold forest floor, its eyes staring after him, pleading for help. He had tried to convince himself that it was the right thing to do, that the wolf's life wasn't worth the cost of his own peace. But in his heart, something kept nagging at him. Something wasn't right. The barn felt emptier now, even though it was filled with animals. The air didn't smell the same anymore, and even his other wolves seemed to know that something had changed. They had always been sensitive creatures, attuned to the emotions of their caretaker, but now they seemed restless, as if they too sensed that the balance of the farm had shifted. Thomas would catch them staring at him with an odd intensity, their golden eyes studying him as though they were waiting for an explanation, an answer to the unspoken question that lingered in the air. Days passed, and life on the farm resumed its regular rhythm. The sheep needed feeding, the horses required grooming, and the fields needed plowing. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had taken root in his chest. He had always prided himself on being a man who did the right thing, who cared for his animals as though they were family. But now, with the memory of that wolf haunting him, he began to question everything. Had he been wrong? Had he given up too soon? His guilt was suffocating, and yet, every time he thought about going back to the forest to see if the wolf had survived, he hesitated. What if it was still there, lying in the cold, still waiting for him to return? What if it was alive, but too weak to move, starving alone? The thought made his stomach churn, but it wasn't enough to push him into action. Then, a week later, something unexpected happened. It was an ordinary afternoon. Thomas was in the barn, mending fences, when he heard a strange noise coming from the direction of the forest. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or the chirp of birds. It was a low, mournful howl. At first, Thomas froze. His heart raced, his breath caught in his chest. The howl was unmistakable. It was the sound of a wolf. But this wasn't just any wolf. It was a cry filled with desperation, a cry that seemed to carry the weight of everything Thomas had been feeling since abandoning the pup. The howl echoed through the trees, and for a moment, Thomas felt as though the world had stopped. His mind raced, his heart pounded. Could it be the wolf? Could it be the very same wolf he had left behind in the forest? He didn't know what came over him, but without a second thought, Thomas grabbed his coat, ran out of the barn, and made his way toward the forest. The air was thick with tension as he made his way through the trees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The howl had stopped, replaced by the eerie silence that often falls when something is out of place. Thomas pushed forward, his feet crunching the dried leaves underfoot. He called out, but there was no response. And then, after what felt like an eternity of searching, he saw something moving in the distance. It was small, almost camouflaged by the shadows of the trees. But there it was, the lone wolf. At first, Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. Could it really be? The wolf's fur was thin and ragged, its body still frail and weak. It wasn't the healthy, strong creature Thomas had hoped for. It was still the same sickly, emaciated pup that he had abandoned just days ago. But something was different now. Its eyes, though still clouded with weakness, held a fierce determination. There was a fire in them now, a fire that hadn't been there when Thomas had first met it. The wolf stumbled toward him, its legs shaky and its breathing labored. It was obvious that it hadn't fully recovered, but there was no mistaking the bond between them. It was as if the wolf had known he would come back, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Thomas stood there, unable to move, his heart in his throat. The world around him seemed to vanish as he locked eyes with the wolf. It was a moment that stretched on forever, a moment filled with a mixture of awe, guilt, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. The wolf approached him slowly, cautiously, but there was no fear in its movements. It seemed to recognize him, and there was something in its eyes, a kind of recognition that went beyond words. It was as though it knew that Thomas was the one who had abandoned it, but it was still willing to give him a second chance. "Shadow," Thomas whispered, almost as though he were asking himself. The wolf responded with a soft whine, as if confirming its identity. The connection between them was undeniable, and in that moment, Thomas understood something deep within himself. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it seemed to vanish, replaced by something stronger, hope. But it wasn't just about saving the wolf anymore. It was about redemption, not just for the wolf, but for himself. Thomas knew that the journey he had started by abandoning the wolf wasn't over. It was only just beginning. He reached down cautiously, offering his hand to Shadow. The wolf hesitated for a moment, but then it took a step forward and nuzzled Thomas's hand with its nose. A sigh of relief escaped Thomas's lips, and he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had a second chance. They both did. Over the next few weeks, Thomas dedicated himself fully to helping the wolf recover. Shadow, as he had named it, was still fragile, but the transformation that began to unfold was miraculous. Shadow's fur grew back, thickening as it filled in with healthy new strands. Its eyes, once dull and lifeless, began to sparkle with the same fiery determination Thomas had seen when they first locked eyes. Shadow was changing, and so was Thomas. Every day, Thomas worked tirelessly to restore the wolf's health. He fed it better food, provided it with ample space to run, and gave it the comfort it needed to heal. He watched in awe as Shadow grew stronger, its movements becoming more fluid and confident. But something else was happening too. Thomas was changing as well. The guilt that had weighed so heavily on his heart began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose. He wasn't just caring for an animal anymore. He was learning the true meaning of redemption. Thomas realized that the wolf wasn't just saving itself, it was saving him. Every time he saw Shadow run through the fields, its strength returning, he was reminded of the lesson the wolf had taught him, that even when we fail, even when we fall, we can rise again. It wasn't just about survival, it was about finding strength in the most unlikely places, and giving second chances when no one else would. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas could sense a gradual change, not only in the wolf, but also in himself. There was a rhythm to the days now, a quiet routine that gave him purpose. The farm, which had once felt burdened by the weight of his guilt, now seemed to breathe with new life. It was as though Thomas's decision to turn back and help Shadow had breathed new energy into everything. The animals were livelier, the crops grew stronger, and the forest around them felt less lonely. Thomas had never been one to speak much. His life had always been defined by quiet work and solitude. But now, as he spent his days tending to Shadow, talking to the wolf became as natural as breathing. Every evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with hues of red and orange, Thomas would sit beside the fire and talk to Shadow. The wolf would lie on the ground, its body now stronger, its once dull fur gleaming in the light. Sometimes, when Thomas would pause, the wolf would look up at him with those deep, knowing eyes, and he'd smile, as though understanding the unspoken words that filled the air. The days passed quickly, and Shadow's health improved at an astonishing rate. There were moments when Thomas could hardly believe the transformation. Shadow had gone from a frail, sickly creature, barely able to walk, to a powerful, graceful animal. It was as if the wolf had become a symbol of hope for both of them, a reminder that recovery wasn't just about healing wounds. It was about rebuilding what had been lost. However, as Shadow grew stronger, a new challenge began to emerge. One evening, as Thomas was cleaning the barn, he noticed something strange. The other wolves in his care, those that had always been content to stay by his side, never venturing far from the farm, were becoming more restless. They were pacing, their eyes darting toward the edge of the forest. It was as if they could feel something pulling them, something calling them. Thomas noticed this change in their behavior and wondered what could be causing it. It wasn't like them to act this way. They had always been loyal, always stayed within the bounds of the farm, knowing their place. But now, it seemed they were searching for something beyond the comfort of their home. And then it happened. One morning, Thomas woke up to find that the wolves were gone. Every single one of them. The barn door, which had been securely shut the night before, was now wide open. The farmyard was eerily quiet. Panic washed over him as he rushed outside, calling for the wolves. There was no response. It was as though they had simply disappeared into thin air. His heart raced, and a sense of dread crept over him. He immediately thought of Shadow. He needed to find it. He couldn't lose the wolf again, not after everything they had been through. Without wasting another second, Thomas grabbed his coat and ran toward the forest, praying that Shadow would be there, waiting for him. As he ventured deeper into the woods, he found the scent of his other wolves, fresh tracks in the dirt, leading him further and further into the forest. But there was something unsettling about these tracks. They were more erratic, as if the wolves were in a hurry. And they weren't alone. Thomas could feel it now, an energy in the forest that he hadn't sensed before. It was almost as though the air itself was charged, alive with something unknown. It wasn't just the wolves that had changed. The forest had changed too. He felt as though the trees were closing in on him, their branches reaching out like fingers, guiding him toward an unknown destination. As he trudged deeper into the woods, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The usual quiet of the trees, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, everything seemed amplified. But there was one sound that stood out among the others, the call of a wolf. It was Shadow. The howl echoed through the trees, clear and sharp, a cry that seemed to hold both power and sadness. It was unlike anything Thomas had heard before. This wasn't the same wolf that had once been weak and frail. It was a leader, a force of nature. And as Thomas followed the sound, he knew deep down that he was no longer the one leading this journey. It was Shadow who was guiding him now. The tracks led him to a clearing deep in the forest. As Thomas entered the space, he stopped dead in his tracks. The sight before him took his breath away. Shadow stood at the center of the clearing, surrounded by the pack of wolves. But these weren't the same wolves that Thomas had raised. These were wild wolves, untamed, powerful, their eyes glowing with a primal intensity. And in the center of it all, standing tall and proud, was Shadow. The wolf had changed. It had evolved into something more than Thomas could have imagined. Shadow was no longer just a pet, no longer just an animal in need of care. It had become a part of the wild, a leader of the pack. The transformation was complete. Thomas stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His heart was torn between two worlds, one where Shadow was his companion, his responsibility, and one where Shadow was meant to run free, to lead its own pack, to follow the call of the wild. He watched in awe as Shadow turned toward him, its golden eyes locking with his. There was no fear in those eyes, no resentment. Instead, there was something else, an understanding. Shadow had found its place in the world, and it wasn't beside Thomas. It was here, with its own kind, where it truly belonged. Thomas took a deep breath, his chest heavy, with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew, in that moment, that he had to let go. He had helped Shadow become the strong, powerful wolf it was today, but it was time for Shadow to continue its journey without him. As if sensing Thomas's thoughts, Shadow let out one final, soulful howl. It was a farewell, a goodbye. Then, with a swift movement, it turned and joined the pack, disappearing into the forest. Thomas stood there for a long time, watching the wolves vanish into the trees. The wind whispered through the leaves, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt at peace. He had done what he could, and in doing so, he had learned something about himself. He had learned that love and compassion weren't always about keeping something close, about holding on with all your might. Sometimes, love meant letting go. It meant giving something the freedom to grow, to evolve, and to become what it was meant to be. With a final glance toward the forest, Thomas turned back toward his farm. The farm that was no longer just a place of work and routine. It was a place of healing. And as he walked back home, he knew that no matter where Shadow's journey took it, he would always carry a part of that wolf with him. A part of its strength, its courage, and its will to survive. It had been a week since Shadow had disappeared into the wild with the pack. And in those days, Thomas had found himself trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. The first few days after Shadow's departure were the hardest. The farm, which had once felt alive with purpose and routine, now felt desolate and empty. The wolves were gone. The air was still, as though holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Thomas tried to keep himself busy. He worked harder than ever before, tending to the fields, fixing fences, cleaning the barn. But no matter how hard he worked, there was an emptiness he couldn't escape. He would catch himself walking toward the barn, only to stop halfway, remembering that the wolves were no longer there. The familiar howl of Shadow was missing from the night. The quiet absence of the pack was deafening. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the loss settled deeper into Thomas's bones. At night, when the work was done and the silence of the farm surrounded him, the memories of Shadow seemed to flood his mind, filling the space where the pain of his decision had once been. He would close his eyes and see the wolf standing in the clearing, eyes full of pride, ready to run free. He would remember the bond they shared, the quiet moments by the fire, the trust that had grown between them. But with each memory, a sharp pain would pierce his heart, a reminder that he had let go, that he had chosen the path of separation. The truth was hard to face. Shadow had become a part of him, and now it was gone. Yet, despite the sorrow, there was something else that kept Thomas going, something he hadn't quite understood yet, something he felt deep within his chest, a sense of peace. Shadow's departure, though heartbreaking, had been a necessary step. The wolf had found its place, its purpose. It was meant to be free. It was meant to lead its own pack, to run wild through the forests, to howl at the moon. And as much as it hurt, Thomas realized that his love for Shadow had always been about freedom. True love, he now understood, wasn't about possession or control. It was about letting go, giving the ones you love the chance to become what they were always meant to be. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple, Thomas stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness. The air was cool, and the breeze rustled the leaves, but there was a stillness that settled deep within him. The wolves were gone, Shadow was gone, but they were still with him, in the lessons they had taught him, in the way his heart had grown. He hadn't realized it until now, but Shadow had healed him in ways he couldn't describe. It wasn't just about saving the wolf, it was about saving himself. As he turned to head back to the farm, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he thought it was a dream, or perhaps his mind playing tricks on him. But then, as the figure emerged from the shadows, he knew. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was Shadow. The wolf stood tall, its fur gleaming in the last light of day. It was different now, stronger, more majestic, but it was still the same wolf, the same creature that had captured his heart and changed his life. Shadow's eyes met his, and in that moment, everything else faded away. Thomas stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest. He didn't know what to say, what to feel. All he knew was that the wolf had returned, and with it, the sense of peace he had been searching for. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Shadow stood there, watching Thomas, its eyes filled with something unspoken, a connection, a bond that went beyond words. And Thomas, in turn, gazed back, understanding in his heart that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. Slowly, cautiously, Thomas took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Shadow didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply stood there, waiting for him to come closer, to make a decision. He took another step, then another, until he was standing just a few feet from the wolf. And then, with a trembling hand, he reached out. Shadow didn't back away. It didn't retreat into the shadows. Instead, it stepped closer, its nose brushing against Thomas's palm. Tears filled Thomas's eyes as he knelt down to meet the wolf. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. Shadow was home, not in the farm, not with Thomas as its sole caretaker, but in the place where it was meant to be free. It was a bond, a connection that would never break, no matter how far apart they were. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt whole again. He didn't feel the pain of loss anymore. He didn't feel the weight of guilt. Instead, he felt a deep sense of peace, of understanding. He had done the right thing. Shadow had found its place in the wild, and now it had come back to him, not as an animal that needed saving, but as a companion that had grown, had learned, and had become something stronger than either of them could have imagined. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, casting the world in twilight, Thomas knew that this was the moment that had been waiting for him all along. It wasn't about Shadow returning to him. It was about the fact that they had both changed. They had both become stronger, and that, Thomas realized, was the true meaning of love. Shadow's return wasn't just a reunion. It was a testament to the power of transformation, to the healing that comes when we allow ourselves to grow, to let go, and to trust the process. Thomas had learned that love was not about holding on tightly to what we fear losing. Love, true love, was about giving others the freedom to become who they were meant to be, even if it meant walking away for a while. Shadow had left to find its place in the world, and in doing so, had given Thomas the greatest gift of all, the ability to let go, to heal, and to understand that true love was never about possession. It was about freedom, and with that understanding, Thomas found peace. If this story moved you and reminded you of the power of love and freedom, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this.